Where the Amazon River meets the Atlantic Ocean is Marajoara Island, the largest island in the Amazon Delta. 1,000 years ago, it was the site of a flourishing culture that lasted nearly 1,000 years and left the world with some of the most stunning pottery to come out of the Americas. Marajoara culture may not have left us with the kind of breathtaking ruins that we see in the rainforests of Guatemala or in the majestic peaks of the Andes, but as we'll see, their culture was every bit as successful. Today, we're going to explore how the people of Marjo Island thrived in the Amazon. Before we start, I do need to make something clear. This episode is going to feel a little more visually lacking compared to previous videos. And that's because Amazonian archaeology is still fairly young and not as much work has been done compared to other areas of the Americas. And on top of that, not much survives in the tropics, which means that we don't have the same kind of material remains in the archaeological record that we usually find. Furthermore, this is a more obscure topic than what I've done until now, and so there's just not as much visual material available. However, I selected Marajoara culture as the first Amazonian topic very deliberately, because as it turns out, Marjo Island was once at the center of a great debate about civilization in the Amazon, and I want to explore that wider debate to give us some context before we actually get into Marjoara culture itself. Everybody ready? Let's go. At the start of the 20th century, there was a misconception in academia about what the pre Columbian Amazon looked like. Compounding this misconception was the fact that sources for the pre Columbian Amazon were far from ideal. To this day, no pre Columbian writing has been found in the Amazon, so what we're left with is oral traditions, archaeology, and accounts from the Spanish and Portuguese. Now let's take a look at those contact period accounts. Surely they must be the best record of the Amazon before colonization, right? Yes and no. The earliest surviving account of the Amazon that we have comes from Spanish priest Gaspar de Carvajal, who in 1541 went over the Andes and into the Amazon with Gonzalo Pizarro, the less famous brother of Inca conqueror Francisco Pizarro, to search for the city of El Dorado. Well, that's not really how it turned out because Gonzalo got left behind in the jungle while the second in command, Francisco de Orellana, took Gaspar and half the party downstream to search for food. After making some progress down the river, Oriana decided to take his chances down the river instead of facing starvation up the river with an angry Gonzalo, and that led him down the full length of the Amazon. I could spend the rest of the episode recounting that story and how amazing it is, but we got a lot to cover. In this account of Oriana's voyage, we get an incredible and fleeting glimpse of the pre-Columbian Amazon. So what did Oriana see when he barreled down the river? As it turns out, a lot. The Amazon basin wasn't a pristine, hostile wilderness, but rather a highway swarming with people living prosperously in large, dense settlements and cities. Carvajal describes one such settlement that stretched for 5 leagues, made up of houses along the riverbank with barely any space between them. Guarding these chiefdoms, kingdoms, and confederations were fleets of hundreds of war canoes and thousands of warriors. The expedition was constantly harassed and attacked by the locals who wanted the Spanish gone. Gee, I wonder why. Oriana and company barely made it to the mouth of the Amazon. The expedition continuously teetered between starvation and outright annihilation. Just as a side note for the film buffs in the audience, this is the expedition that actually inspired Werner Herzog's classic film, Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Totally worth a watch if you haven't seen it. Klaus Kinski's performance is memorable, but I digress. Oriana would actually return to the Amazon for a second time, but due to numerous difficulties, least of which was his untimely death, they never got past the coast, and the expedition ended in dismal failure. Carvajal returned to Lima where he lived out the rest of his life, presumably very thankful to be alive. His account would not be officially published until 1894. By the time later explorers returned deep into the Amazonian interior, all that Oriana and his compatriots had witnessed was gone. We know in hindsight that disease, Portuguese conquest, and slave hunting completely decimated the indigenous population. Prior to contact, the population of the Amazon is estimated to have numbered around 8 million people, but some estimates go even higher. By 1730, only about 153,000 indigenous Amazonians were living. To put that in perspective, that's like everyone in the United States outside of the state of Indiana just disappearing. That is a catastrophic demographic collapse. Back then, the extent and consequences of this demographic disaster were not fully appreciated, and by looking at the shattered remnants of the indigenous people still living there, scholars and ethnographers got a very warped idea of what the pre Columbian Amazon was like. After a trip down the Amazon in the early 18th century, French traveler Charles Marie de la Condamine spoke of the native Amazonians as forest animals that had to be made human before they could even be made Christian. Later scholars described the tropics as an environment that arrested the development of its inhabitants, like a child left in a nursery for their entire youth. To some extent, this attitude still persists, fueled by lingering stereotypes of Amazonian people still living in the rainforest. Against all this, the account of Oriana's voyage was largely ignored. Since its publication, there had been some serious doubts about its veracity, especially given some of the more colorful passages in it. In one infamous chapter, Carvajal recorded an attack from a tribe of giant topless warrior women, which incidentally is what lent the Amazon River its name. Probably fair to say that it was a bit embellished or misunderstood. Passages like these help discredit Oriana's account and the notion of a highly populated Amazon. Scientists believe that the Amazon instead had been sparsely populated by simple hunter gatherer societies. They reasoned that because Amazonian soils were too poor for sustained intensive agriculture, such populations and urban life would have been impossible. And to be fair, the soil in the rainforest is notoriously poor, so this conclusion does make some sense on the surface. Thus, they argued, the only way they could have farmed would have been using slash and burn agriculture, which would have quickly depleted the limited nutrients in the soil before forcing the people to abandon the area. This conclusion was summed up in a famous article by Dr. Betty Meggers in 1954 called Environmental Limitation on the Development of Culture. To quote the article,
"There is a force at work to which man through his culture must bow. This determinant operates uniformly regardless of time, place, within the forest, psychology, or race. Its leveling effect appears to be inescapable. Even modern efforts to implant civilization in the South American tropical forest have met with defeat, or survive only with constant assistance from the outside. In short, the environmental potential of the tropical forest is sufficient to allow the evolution of culture to proceed only to the level represented by slash and burn farmers. Further indigenous evolution is impossible, and any more highly evolved culture attempting to settle and maintain itself in the tropical forest environment will inevitably decline to the slash and burn level."
Meggers actually drew this conclusion in part from work that she and her husband did on Marajoara Island. They had excavated some mound sites there in the late 40s and noticed something unusual about the site. The earliest pottery and burials on the island were the most fine and elaborate. As time went on, that quality declined. Social stratification vanished until everyone was buried in the same basic fashion. In her famous work, Amazonia, Man and Culture in a Counterfeit Paradise, Meggers interpreted this as proof that a sophisticated culture, possibly recent arrivals from the Andes, had migrated to Marajo, settled on the island, and inevitably declined as its environmental productivity had dwindled. After all, she reasoned, there was no archaeological evidence of a rise, only a long, steady fall until it was indistinguishable from other Amazonian societies as they were understood back then. Now, before everybody goes to the comments to dogpile on Dr. Meggers, I do want to give her credit where credit is due. Archaeology had traditionally avoided the tropics where organic material disintegrates and excavation conditions are harsh, and her decision to research on Marajo Island with her husband was a very bold one, despite the shortcomings of their conclusions. Thankfully, though, these conclusions were later challenged when archaeologist Anna Roosevelt returned to Marajo Island for some fresh excavation and perspectives in the 1980s. She employed newer archaeological techniques and technology for her excavations. By the end of the project a few years later, her findings had demolished Megger's earlier conclusions and turned everything known about Marajoara culture upside down. Her report showed that Marajoara culture had flourished for centuries and that the culture was not derivative, but local. Far from being at the mercy of a hostile environment, the ancient people of Marjo Island had mastered it with ingenuity and resourcefulness. Roosevelt could finally see Marajoara culture for what it was. In her own summary,
The Marajoara culture was one of the outstanding non literate complex societies of the world. During its reign, from about AD 400 to 1300, the society made great achievements in earthen construction and ceremonial art. It was responsible for the erection of hundreds of monumental earthen mounds that served as platforms for numerous large and small settlements and urn cemeteries. The society developed an intensive subsistence system that maintained large population centers for almost 1,000 years. The multicolored, modeled, and incised ceramics created for ceremonial use by these people reveal a cosmology and ritual of great complexity and beauty.
before we dive into this culture, let's look at the geography of where we are. Gotta eat your appetizers before the main course, am I right? Marjo Island is big. So big that it surpasses the likes of Taiwan, Sicily, and Vancouver Island. The island is formed by alluvial sediment deposited by the river that has built up over millennia. Now, you might expect the island to be forested, after all, we are in the Amazon, but actually only about half the island is forested. Its eastern half is dominated by a tropical savanna that seasonally floods from February to June, and that's where nearly all the Marajoara sites are found. When the landscape isn't flooded, it's constantly drying out in the hot equatorial sun. The savanna soil on the island is actually pretty nutrient rich and comparable to other soils of other large seasonally inundated rivers like the Nile, the Indus, and the Mississippi. The problem is that the soil has a lot of clay in it, and thus it's prone to waterlogging, which impacts its utility. Professional analysis of the soil classifies it as restrictive or unsuited for agriculture. Another limiting factor for human settlement is that Marijo Island is extremely poor in quality stone. No metamorphic or igneous rock sources are found on the island at all. This meant that the inhabitants had to import lithics for their tools from the mainland, and that represented a huge expense. This may look like a limited environment, but in fact, the people of Marjo Island rose to the challenge and skillfully exploited the potential of the landscape and river. If there's one thing I hope that we're learning in these videos, it's that humans are a very savvy bunch, and indigenous Americans were no exception. With that in mind, it shouldn't be a big surprise to learn that there's actually a fairly long history of human habitation on the island. Shell middens have been identified on the island, but not yet excavated. For those who aren't aware, a shell midden is a small mound built up of discarded mollusk shells that are often left behind by people consuming the mollusks over a long period of time. Judging by similar middens in nearby areas, these likely date from 5000 BCE to 3000 BCE. By 1500 BCE, small villages of pottery producers were established, and the locals appear to have carved out a living by hunting, foraging, and fishing, with some small scale cultivation on the side. All of this changed around 800 CE as these settlements began to consolidate into small chiefdoms across the island. This is the point where Marajoara culture really begins to take off. During this time, elaborate pottery, elite burials, and material culture appeared, and with them, great mound sites began to be constructed. Accompanying this was an increase in population as well as density. In fact, estimates put the peak population of Marjo Island during Marajoara culture around 100,000 people, perhaps even higher, with individual chiefdoms being made up of about 1,000 to 1,300 people. If you crunch the numbers, you get a population density of about 5 to 10 people per square kilometer. That's impressive. So, what made Marajoara culture so successful? The first thing they had to do was to find a high and dry place to live. To this end, they built huge earth mounds on which to build their settlements. Recent work has actually cast some doubt as to whether all of these mounds are entirely artificial, and there's some new research that suggests that the people took natural high points and expanded them to accommodate their settlements and longhouses. Regardless, they were a very impressive feat of engineering. And don't get the idea that these are just a few mounds here and there. Some multi-mound sites on Marjo Island are more than 10 square kilometers in area, with anywhere from 20 to 40 individual mounds. These mounds range anywhere from 3 to 20 meters in height, with an average of about 7 meters. The largest known mound is more than 90 hectares in size, though comparatively short in stature. These raised settlements allowed the inhabitants to withstand the seasonal floods that would inundate the ground, but they could have also served a defensive function as well. Ideally, these would have been built for easy access to fish and transport. Canoes would have been necessary for travel during the floods, and they would have allowed for easy access between different mounds and settlements. Don't picture them as helplessly trapped upon those mounds during the wet seasons. They would have gotten around easily. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that all Marajoara sites are made up of mounds. There are some non-mound sites, particularly in the gallery forests. All in all, there are over 400 individual sites known on the island, and these sites were continuously populated. It's not like there was one house on each mound. Each mound would have been packed with houses and dense populations, so space would have been at a premium. Houses on these mounds would have been large multifamily structures built of poles and thatch roofs. These would have had floors surfaced with white sand that would have been kept clean. In each house, a large trough-shaped hearth made of baked clay would have been used for cooking, and these would have been large enough to hold multiple pots. Excavations show that these houses and cooking facilities were constantly rebuilt and repaired over time. Some houses have as many as 20 foundations built on top of one another. Like I said earlier, Marajoara culture was not a flash, it was enduring. These houses and settlements were not haphazardly thrown up. They were carefully planned. They had to be in order to accommodate the populations that were living there. But why would so many people go through all the trouble of making a permanent home in such a flood-prone environment? The answer should be pretty obvious. The Amazon River teems with aquatic life, and making your home in this flooded landscape would have been like having an all-you-can-eat seafood buffet on your doorstep. Excavations of middens and trash heaps at mound sites show an abundance of small fish and turtles, which made up the majority of the diet. Larger fish, birds, and terrestrial mammals like capybara and deer are rare, but they're still found. These fish would have been easy to gather during the wet seasons, but the people of Marjo Island constructed sophisticated hydraulic works to exploit these resources year-round. They constructed dams and fishing weirs that would hold water in place so that they could trap the fish that would return to the island to spawn. As the savanna dried out during the dry season, these shrinking pools would have been important sources of food. Animals like turtles could be trapped and kept in pens until they were needed. If we look at historical accounts, we can surmise that fish would have been dried out or preserved in manatee fat or turtle oil for later consumption. This aquatic management would have ensured that sources of protein were available during the dry season. In fact, control of these aquatic resources was probably an important basis of power for the elite, and this is further suggested by the placement of elite residences. But what else were the Marajoara consuming? Unfortunately, information on Marajoara diet is somewhat limited, but from what we can tell, seeds and palms were important sources of food. Now, I do want to emphasize that crops were not the primary food source at Marjo Island, and realistically, it would have been difficult to lean heavily on agriculture in such restrictive soil. In future Amazonian episodes, we'll see some ingenious methods of coping with poor soils, but on Marjo Island, it doesn't seem to have been a pressing concern for the inhabitants. Despite being very content to live off the river's bounty, they still balance their diet with an assortment of cultivated plants. Maize does appear to have been grown and consumed, but unlike the usual pattern that we've seen in the Americas, maize was a secondary crop. It's likely that it was being grown mainly for use in ceremonies like maize beer. More important than maize was manioc. You might also know it as cassava. For those of you who aren't familiar with manioc, it's a root vegetable that's very rich in carbohydrates and was cultivated for millennia in South America as a staple crop. Manioc could be turned into flour and in turn baked into bread. It was so successful that it even entered Mesoamerica and the Caribbean. Who knows, it might even get its own special episode someday. But even that was probably not the most important crop grown by the Marajoara people. That honor goes to the acai palm. When you think of palm trees, you probably instinctively think of coconuts. But Amazonian peoples made enormous use of domesticated and semi domesticated palm trees. Acai palms are incredibly productive trees. Most important to our discussion, they can thrive in nutrient poor soils, which makes them extremely useful in the Amazon. The acai palm produces a fruit similar in size to a blueberry that, when crushed, produces a thick juice rich in calories. Together with fish, these crops fed the growth of the Marjo population. Even today, fish, manioc flour, and acai juice are consumed regularly by thousands of people across the Amazon. All of this was a winning combination. Analysis of bones from Marajoara burials show that they were a very healthy people of large stature and with fewer pathologies than modern indigenous Amazonians. Just a disclaimer, these skeletons are predominantly male, so this is not an ideal sample of the entire society. So take that with a grain of salt. Let's shift our focus from consumption to production and take a closer look at Marajoara pottery. These ceramics are exquisitely crafted and totally mesmerizing to look at. They are undoubtedly the hallmark of Marajoara culture, and you'll see these in museum collections and exhibits around the world. These polychrome ceramics are also among the earliest known polychrome works in all the Americas. The most famous examples are their large funerary urns. These urns are much bigger than they appear. They can be over a meter high and over 3 centimeters thick. I hope that these pictures do them justice. They feature beautiful and precisely painted designs with animals and faces molded into them. Other designs are actually sculpted to resemble humans. In most cases, these depict seated women who appear to be pregnant, which may be a symbol of the rebirth of the dead. Now, not all funerary urns were so elaborate. Smaller, more simple designs were also used to inter the remains of more common people. Other ceramics also survive in plenty, and these can be no less dazzling. It's certainly true that most functional pottery would have been plain or characterized by simpler and non representative decoration. More elaborate serving vessels were likely used for ritual feasting and celebration. Where there is decoration in these types of ceramics, the main method of decoration is incision and slip. These carved incisions are extraordinarily intricate and feature animal, human features, and abstract shapes. You can find caimans, monkeys, turtles, snakes, and other animals in these designs. These creatures likely had a special meaning in Marjoara myths and legends, and although we can't be completely sure of their significance, we can draw some clues from other historical cultures. In many Amazonian mythologies, for example, snakes are often connected to water and abundance, and that could have been the case on Marjo Island as well. Other pieces are also painted with red, white, and sometimes black designs. Geometric designs are commonly found on bowls and plates. One final important ceramic item that we need to mention are tangas. Now, you may be asking what a tanga is. A tanga is a triangular ceramic pubic covering worn by women and fastened by cords around the waist and between the legs. Because these are all very individually shaped and sized, it's believed that these were made for specific people. Many of them are plain, but some are finely decorated. These decorations likely conveyed information about social roles, positions, and kinship. Tangas were probably important items in rites of passage for women, such as attaining adulthood, initiations, or marriage. With all this pottery, you might get the impression that pottery was being made year round, but it's likely that pottery would have only been able to have been made during the dry season when clay sources became available after the seasonal floods subsided. Clay pots were also fired in an open fire rather than a kiln, so making ceramics, especially larger pieces during the rainy season, would have been very difficult. Although this is debated, the complexity of these works suggests that they were made by specialists who were directed by an elite. So, what can all this tell us about Marajoara culture and society? Unfortunately, the evidence for this is limited, and what conclusions we can draw come from their elaborate mortuary practices. So, let's focus our attention there. Most burials in Marajoara culture are characterized by the practice of secondary burials. What makes a burial secondary? Rather than being buried immediately, secondary burial is when a body is buried at a later time. From what we can tell, bodies were stored in some type of charnel house where the flesh of the body would decompose before the disarticulated bones could be ceremoniously interred or buried. These bones were set in ceramic urns where they could be displayed in a shrine and venerated by their family and kin. They were eventually buried in the ground and topped with a new layer of earth. Over time, these cemeteries were built up in vertical layers of clustered urns as the mounds were expanded again and again. There are some cases of these urns being found below houses, but it's uncertain if this is intentional or incidental placement. Now, you may be asking, why would people wait to bury a body and leave it to decompose? This likely allowed people a mourning period, time for any needed social transition, and also time to assemble the necessary resources to prepare an elaborate funeral. Anna Roosevelt has also observed that in the Amazon today, bones are considered the residence of a person's spirit, while the flesh is seen as earthly and fleeting, and so bones can often be seen as receptacles of one's power. Another obvious advantage of this is that it allows you to bury a body in a smaller space, and when space is limited, that can be an important consideration. In some cases, the defleshed bones would have undergone additional preparation for burial. Bones that have been painted red or black have been found in multiple urns. However, secondary inhumation wasn't always the order of the day. Very large urns have flexed burials. For the non archaeologists out there, a flexed burial is when a body is laid in a crouching position where the legs are bent at the knees or flexed, like this. Along with the bones of the deceased, other offerings would be interred in the urn. Stone axes, beads, and tongas have been recovered, but it's believed that other perishable items made of wood, feathers, and fibers would have also been used as offerings as well. Stone axes held a special significance as valued items because, as I mentioned earlier, good quality stone for lithics is not available on Marajoara Island, which meant that lithic materials had to be imported, sometimes from hundreds of kilometers away on the mainland. These burials are compelling evidence that Marajoara society was stratified, but whether this was stratified by gender, class, or rank, or some combination thereof, we can't say for certain. Interestingly, those tongas, the predominance of female imagery on funerary urns, house patterns, and later historical accounts of the region led Anna Roosevelt to theorize that Marajoara society was matrilineal, meaning that rights to land, water, identity, and privilege would have been passed through the mother's line, not the father's. In such societies, men typically leave their families to join the families of their wife. Now, just a point of clarification, that doesn't always mean that women have a higher social status than men. It only refers to how ancestry and descent are tracked. People who are familiar with West African history will also be familiar with patriarchal societies that practice matrilineal succession. With this in mind, it's likely that the remains of elders and ancestors were revered as links to a divine or semi divine lineage founder. The female imagery on the urns suggests that these lineage founders were matrilineal figures. Women likely had special positions in Marajoara society, something that isn't very common in modern Amazonian societies today. Pretty cool. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of Marajoara burials that have been excavated are male, so it's difficult to clarify what this would have meant for the lives of everyday women. For almost 1,000 years, Marajoara culture flourished and evolved. It was immensely successful and enduring. However, for reasons that are not well understood, it appears to have petered out by about 1400 CE. Many theories have been proposed, but the evidence recovered so far is scant. Hopefully, more archaeological work in the future will shed more light on this. One thing that is known, however, is that Arawak populations began to move into the island and build new settlements. It's unknown if this was a cause of Marajoara decline or a consequence of it. Regardless, Marajoara culture vanished before any Europeans could ever witness their ways of life. Marajoara Island is a fascinating case of what's possible in the Amazon, an environment considered for centuries to be far less than optimal. Marajoara people ingeniously altered their landscape so that they could thrive for centuries, and left future generations some of the most brilliant artwork of pre Columbian South America. I don't want to leave you with the notion that this was the do all end all of Amazonian civilization. In future episodes, we'll see how other cultures adapted to the Amazon and flourished. Believe me, there's good stuff ahead. But that's going to wrap us up for today. Special thanks to my patrons listed here. You guys are the best. If you'd like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Facebook. Take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.